We're really delighted to have Michael Frank with us this evening. Michael has tried his hand at various forms of writing over the years. He's done short stories and essays that have been anthologized. A collection of his travel writing can be found in Italy, the best travel writing from the New York Times. And for nearly a decade, he served as a contributing writer to the Los Angeles Times Book Review. Now he's out with a memoir entitled The Mighty Franks, which reflects on some rather eccentric family dynamics, I guess you could say, especially the overbearing influence on Michael's life of his accomplished aunt. The aunt is Harriet Frank Jr., who was married to Irving Ravetch. They were both Hollywood screenwriters active in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and responsible for authoring such Oscar-nominated classics as HUD and Norma Rae. Michael's aunt and uncle, who were themselves childless, lived close to Michael's own family in the Laurel Canyon neighborhood in Los Angeles. And Harriet, known as Aunt Hanky, took particular interest in Michael's upbringing, aggressively guiding his interest in art and culture, bestowing gifts on him, and in general becoming a major force in his life and a major disruptor in his family. In the book, Michael looks back and sees his troubled aunt with all her narcissistic and manipulative tendencies in ways that his younger, overwhelmed self could not fully grasp at the time. And his story prompts all of us to think, among other things, about where the boundaries of family life should be drawn and who should draw them. Now, as an added attraction, Michael will be in conversation here this evening with Sarah Boxer, who is herself a writer of nonfiction and graphic fiction, and who has worked for the New York Times and contributed to the Atlantic and other publications. Sarah's also done two books, one a cartoon novel, In the Floyd Archives, the other an anthology of blogs called Ultimate Blogs. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Michael Frank and Sarah Boxer.
I'd like to just give you a little background about why I'm up here with him. Him's who he now calls himself the talent.
Okay. In family context.
Oops, this is our family now. The first time I met Michael, we were at an Indian restaurant, and I remember drawing together with him with sugar on the table. It was kind of a Rorschach test or exquisite corpse drawing. I don't know whether you remember this. And I thought it was a whole lot of fun, or at least, I thought so. And I heard that Michael found it a little traumatic, and now I see him looking to see what's coming up. How could this have been traumatic? Well, it took me 25 years to learn that there is a very special kind of trauma that is Michael. And it is, I have to say, quickly, that this trauma is a marvelous thing now that the trauma has been taught to heal and roll over and play dead and, above all, speak. As I got to know Michael, I heard bits and pieces of his family history, and you've heard a few just now. There was something terrible, almost unspeakable, about his bond with his aunt, so we never spoke of it. What I did know about his aunt and uncle, I found out through Google. They were a famous Hollywood screenwriting team, as you've just heard. And I did get a chance to meet his aunt and could see the sort of Sunset Boulevard sort of drama queen she was. But she seemed harmless enough. I also knew a little bit about the odd architecture of Michael's family. It was really twisted, or perhaps maybe braided. His brother and sister married his sister and brother, and the two grandmothers lived together. One couple had kids, the other didn't. One was famous, the other wasn't. Bizarre, yes, but traumatic? Why? Last year, after years of begging to see the manuscript, I was finally allowed to read the galley proofs. of what is now called the Mighty Franks, which we have before us. And I was given a copy and told in no uncertain terms not to share it with anyone else and to never read it in front of him. So I obediently read it, but then I decided to immediately share it with everyone I knew. Sorry, Michael. And the reason was I was just blown away, not only by the story itself, but by the beautiful writing and the incredible bravery it took for him to publish it while some of the main characters are and were still living and breathing and above all reading. I think of the Mighty Franks as a psychological thriller. It's the story of Michael's abduction. This is my telling, of course. He'll have a different version. Abduction by his Aunt Hanky and their intense love affair and how it ended. It is funny and trenchant and shockingly well observed and sad, very, very sad. Jonathan Franzen said, and I've been told this by more than one person, that is the best book he has read since Elena Ferrante's trilogy. In The Atlantic, Ann Holbert praised the book's Proustian acuity. Michael Saylor of the Times Literary Supplement said, Michael Frank's memoir may be the first to expose narrative abuse. Great term. Philip Hoare of The Guardian called Michael a master of self-reflection. He concluded, I doubt you'll read a better memoir this year. So here is the author of The Mighty Franks, my friend, at least for this evening, Michael Frank.
I'm not so sure about that, Sarah, but thank you very much for that beautiful introduction. Is that on, I guess? Kind of close, okay. And thank you all for coming, and thank you everyone at Politics and Prose for this beautiful evening. Just so you know now, there's a reception downstairs in the cafe so we can hang out and visit afterward. When I went to England to meet the Fourth Estate publishers and editors who are publishing the book, who have published the book in tandem with FSG here, I sat at this table. It was the first time I'd been confronted by so many stranger readers, as I call them. And at the end of the conversation, someone said to me, when did you realize that your childhood was so strange? And I paused for a moment and I said, was it strange? And I really meant that because despite all of the language that you hear around the story, I never really thought of it as strange. I simply thought of it as this story that I had to find a way eventually in my life to tell. And as I write in the book, and as I've said elsewhere, I did try to write it as a novel years ago. And I got a bit lost, I think. Well, I finished the book, but I think I didn't have the distance, the clarity, the detachment that I since acquired. And also, many of my readers, potential buyers of the book, said that the figure of my aunt was not credible. And that really stayed with me for a long time. As you heard, I write short fiction. I prefer, or I used to prefer to write fiction. But that word credible directed me somewhat down a different path. And there's this wonderful quote someone sent me just the other day from Natalia Ginsburg, in which she said, autobiography crept up on me like a wolf. And in a sense, this book is my wolf. Though I don't think of it as an autobiography, I have to say, because I think that suggests a kind of compendiousness, if you will, that isn't what I'm doing here. I'm really following one line through my life, one line through this story, a line that branches in various directions and makes all kinds of digressions and discursions, but it's really one line, which was also a freeing way of framing the experience of conceiving and writing this book, because there's so much you leave out, there's so much you're required to leave out to make a good book, a good story, a story that is good to my thinking as a story with suspense and pace, and the one that is curious about itself. And that was the other thing that was very important to me. I had to arrive at a point in my life where I, instead of knowing what I thought I knew about this story, I had to revisit it with a kind of openness and curiosity. Because otherwise, why spend 3 years in front of the computer saying what you know? Instead, it was about discovering how things happened, discovering who these people were really and how they came to be, and ultimately, I hope, finding some compassion in the way I regarded some of these larger-than-life, and in the end, quite tyrannical figures who held a certain strange power over me during a period of childhood that I think of as a state of prolonged enchantment, basically. Those are my words, anyway, of introduction. And I think Sarah wanted me to read just a tiny bit to give those of you, some of you I know have read the book, some of you have not, some of you don't know anything about it. So a little bit of language may be a nice thing to hear. And I thought I would just read, at least for now, just the opening page and then the description of the two central women in my life, that is to say my aunt and my mother. And just to clarify one thing, two or more things. It was my father and his sister who married my uncle and his, am I doing this wrong? I can't tell, thank you. I can't believe getting it wrong. Brother and sister married sister and brother. So my aunt and uncle were the older set of siblings who were childless. They lived always 10 minutes away from us in Laurel Canyon. In addition, the two widowed mothers of these pairs of siblings, my grandmothers, lived together for 12 long and very unhappy years, 10 minutes away from us. That's not even going into the girls across the street who were cousins of cousins and all of it was like the shtetl of Laurel Canyon in the 70s. The other thing to talk about just briefly is the title. My paternal grandmother, so the mother of my aunt and my father, was a very vivid and complicated woman who was eventually named Harriet Frank Sr. I say eventually because she changed her name 6 times in the course of her life. Ultimately, in 1939, taking her daughter's name for herself, which is, I don't think, something we've heard before, and nor do I think we've heard or come across, I haven't anyway, women who are senior and junior. So my aunt was, at that point, Harriet Frank, period. Harriet, my aunt, my grandmother said, was a writer's name, and hence that's why she named her daughter Harriet. My grandmother in 1939 came to Hollywood, abandoning for a while anyway her marriage and a city, Portland, Oregon, that she despised, in-laws she detested, poverty brought on by greatly falling fortunes in the Depression. And she reinvented herself as a story editor to Louis B. Mayer, which is one of the few jobs that women in that era could hold in Hollywood behind the screen. And for 15 years, she read books, told stories, and helped decide, by pitching them to the man who ultimately decided what material should be made into movies. Coinciding with her arrival in California and her reinvention in that professional way, she decided to reinvent herself personally, changed her name to Harriet Frank Sr., and started referring to the family as the Mighty Franks, who could, from that point forward, accomplish just about anything they set their mind to. This was also a very Southern California, Los Angeles / Hollywood idea that you could simply jettison your past, remake yourself, remake your identity, your name, your house, your marriage, just about everything. I intend it with somewhat more irony than she did. Overheard. My feeling for Mike is something out of the ordinary, I overhear my aunt say to my mother one day when I'm 8 years old. It's stronger than I am. I cannot explain it. He's simply the most marvelous child I have ever known, and I love him beyond life itself. Beyond life itself. At first, I feel lucky to be so cherished, singled out to receive a love that is so vast. But then I stop to think about it. I'm not sure what it means, really, to be loved beyond life itself. Do I love my own mother that way? Does she me? Is such a thing even possible? And why me and not my 2 younger brothers? What do I have that they do not? I wish he were mine, my aunt blurts after a moment. From where I'm crouching on the stairs in the entry hall, I can feel the weather in the room change. A long, tense pause opens up between the 2 women. I hear them breathing back and forth into that pause. They are sitting at right angles to each other, I know, my aunt on the sofa, my mother in the chair next to it. This is how they always sit in our living room. Not face to face, but perpendicular, so that they don't have to make eye contact if they don't want to. I wish you had a child of your own, my mother says carefully, ever the second fiddle, the third born, the diplomat. So do I, says my aunt in a pitched, emotional voice. Maybe you would be a different person if you did. My mother does not say this. She thinks it, though. Everybody in our family does. But that's not what happened. This is. So the book opens. And I'll give you then this further taste of the two women. Actually, no. I'll give you a taste, I think, instead of my aunt coming to collect me on Saturday morning. A long-standing ritual. I'll give you a little bit of both. How's that? My mother was short. Petite and mignonne. That's our Morona, my aunt said. Adorable, she said, pronouncing the word à la française as if she were speaking about a little girl or doll. My mother's doll-like tendencies, such as they were, had been in slow retreat ever since she'd had her children, but to my aunt, Morona was in many ways still the timid 13-year-old that she had first met a few months after she and my uncle began going out together. There was nothing doll-like about my aunt. She was a tall, big-boned, round-faced, incandescent-eyed woman. Formidable, people often said of her, though never with the hint of mockery that was conveyed when the word was pronounced with a French accent, and certainly never to her face. I considered her quite simply to be the most magical human being I knew. Everything she touched, everything she did, was golden, infused with a special knowledge and a teeming vitality that transformed an ordinary conversation or meal or room or moment into an enchanted one. Not just to me, but to lots of other people, she was a great beauty, part Rosalind Russell, part brunette Lucille Ball, though she apparently mockingly, described herself as the forever too tall, too ugly adolescent with the imperfect nose that her mother had revised as a 17th birthday present. Her hair went up high, higher even than my mother's ever did, well before the bunning years. She fastened flowers, or memorably leaves, in these rounded towers, or wrapped them in scarves, or concealed them behind berets, tams, cloches, or baseball caps that she chose for their color and not because of her affinity for any particular team. She colored her eyelids blue or violet, and well into the 1990s, she penciled a flapperish beauty mark at the top of her right cheek. She wore quantities of jewelry as she aged, more and more of it often collated into thematic collections as profuse as the collections of objects in her house. She treated herself, essentially, as a surface to decorate, and like the other surfaces she decorated, the finish effect asked to be noticed always, was noticed always. Her linguistic powers were inimitable. Intimidating at times, she commanded torrents of words that merged into impeccable sentences the way raindrops collected into puddles. In story meetings, she was a master of the pitch. She sat forward in her chair, elbows on her knees, a Merit smoking itself in one hand, and let fly. In 15, 20 minutes to a hushed room, she would render an entire movie from fade in to fade out without glancing at a single written note. Her scent was a Caswell Massey's men's cologne that she bought at iMagnet. When I climbed into the car, its spiciness came gusting up out of her collar as she lowered a rouged cheek for me to kiss. Reach around and back, lovey, she said. I brought forward a wrap package tied with a bow so crisp it might have been dipped in starch. What are you waiting for? Go ahead, open it. The present was a book titled Famous Paintings. I glanced inside. Each chapter was devoted to a different subject: landscape, portraits, people working, children at play. Thank you, Auntie Hanky. It's beautiful. Again the cheek lowered. Again I kissed it. A little something to celebrate our Saturday together. She nudged me with her elbow. I'm sure you will be an artist one day, Mike. I'm convinced of it. Everything you do has such style. Really and truly, it's as if you've been immersed in aesthetics your whole entire life. I was 9. Make beauty at all times. It's one of our family tenets, you know. What's a tenet? A rule you live by, you build your life by. Make beauty at all times. Yes, in what you draw or paint, in the houses you inhabit, in the way you speak, too, and write. And, of course, be fast about it. Quick, quick. You've heard me say that before. I nodded. There's plenty of time to sleep in the grave. I must have seemed puzzled because she added, "It means no stopping, no roadblocks allowed, no naps." My mother took one every day. "You must make every moment count," she said, and you must never be afraid to dare. Imagine if Huffy, my grandmother, had never dared. Imagine after 10 long, horrible years of the Depression in Portland, she had not seized the opportunity when Mayer granted her an interview. Everything, all of it, everything that makes us the Mighty Franks comes from that moment, from Huffy, because of her boldness and her courage. Do you understand? I shook my head. Well, you will. One day, I'll make sure of that. We glided down out of the canyon. As she turned right onto Laurel Canyon Boulevard, she continued, "Follow your heart wherever it takes you, and always give away whatever possession is most dear to you." I looked down at the pages of my new book. "You mean I have to give this to Danny or Steve, my younger brothers, one day?" She cocked her head. "I would say not in this particular case, love. Your brother's interests are so markedly different from yours. Wouldn't you agree, Danny? Now, he's a budding scientist, a logistician. It's written all over him. He's going to be a man of facts. I'm as sure of it as I am of my own breath. As for the little one, I see athletics in his future. He's very skilled physically, just like my brother. Maybe like him, he'll develop a gift for business. Yes, I'm sure he will. We need that in the family, do we not? As a kind of ballast. It's only practical. Literature, though, art, architecture, the creative in any form of expression, that's your purview." Purview was like tenant, but I didn't have to ask. "It means area of expertise, strength." She gestured at the book. "No, this one is earmarked for you, as is so much more." There you go. There's a taste anyway.
Well, this raises a question that I had over and over again in the thing. So he's 8 years old at this point, and
9.
he's a little older than that now, and yet he remembers, like, word for word exactly, well, we think exactly. So I would like to know, how did you take notes as like a,
Yes,
a
I was
kid?
tape recording when I was
Tape
8 years old, of course.
No,
So
how did that work?
this worked a couple of ways. One is that my aunt and my uncle were very stylistically set speakers, and so they went on talking the way they had when I was a child, well into my adulthood. And so in a way, I felt quite confident doing what Henry James, when he was talking about Notes of a Son and Brother, the second or first volume of his projected 3-part autobiography, said was important to do in your earliest childhood, which was to live back imaginatively. Mm-hmm. So there is some living back imaginatively in these early years, but I feel very confident in my choices of drawing scenes and writing in dialogue, because one of the, I now understand it, ways I lived through this experience, which became much more complicated, as you can imagine, and darker as I grew older and as the story unfolds, was by paying attention. That was sort of my solution. I couldn't break free. I didn't know how to be independent. I didn't know how to speak up. I didn't know what autonomy or individuality were, but I did know how to observe, and then later spy, overhear, eavesdrop, look into documents I shouldn't have looked into, perhaps, and collect information. And so a mixture of all of these detective-like and perhaps in some ways life-saving gestures have allowed me to render these early scenes.
And how much, what was the other part of the research? Did you go back and interview people and say, well, what was going on here really, or was it all as remembered?
When I was 9 years old, my grandmother gave me my first diary, which I started keeping, and of course it was full of profound observations like went swimming today or watched TV. But scraps of information made it through, and of course as I got older and became more conscious, I wrote more and more. And so at a certain point in the book, a lot of the material, some of the most distressing parts of the book, come quite literally from my diaries that I kept, close to certain incidents. What was the question? Was that the answer?
That'll do.
Interview, yes.
Interview, yes.
My mother is an incredible repository of information, and I've been tapping into her for my whole life. Now when she calls, I simply turn on the computer, put my phone up to my ear, and write just about everything down. And she's gotten more, because she was such a good girl herself in her youth, and so overpowered by some of the same people I was overpowered by. And now that she's an older woman, she's that much freer, much more freer, with all of her truth, her humor, her biting observations, and they've been incredibly useful to me. And my brothers were also helpful on that
You
front.
interviewed them?
They actually, upon reading earlier drafts of the book, asked me why I didn't put in certain things that I'd either overlooked or out of respect had not included because they were personal to them, and I suddenly felt a lot freer to add them. Yeah.
I will also, you alluded to the fact that you tried this as fiction first and memoir second, and I would like to know sort of from the inside, sort of what the experience was like for both, and which one was more freeing for you?
Most certainly The Wolf, the nonfiction in this case, I think.
Why?
Yeah. I think when I was writing it as fiction, I was still trying to use the writing of it to liberate me from the experience, however disguised it was or reimagined. But in writing it as fact, as memoir, it was a different. I had already been freed of the experience when I began the book, and so that, as I said in the very beginning, that allowed me to be curious and investigative, to quest rather than to liberate. And I think that made for, I'm certain it made for a better book as a result. I think I was angrier when I wrote it as fiction also, and I don't think anger is, although people have very different ideas about this. Cynthia Ozick, for example, believes greatly that writers write out of revenge. That really wasn't my conscious, I don't think even unconscious goal here, or motivation here.
Everyone I've talked to has had a very different take on it, and some people find it just a really tragic, sad story, which it is. But I found myself thinking, what a great gift your aunt gave to you, to have this, to have plucked you as the flower of the family, and also to have presented you with this fully formed character, this incredible story. Do you ever think of it in those terms, or is it all sort of like, oh dear?
I think of it in changing terms. I think you were the first person to respond in that way. Other people have since. My brother, who's also a writer, and I have often wondered, would we be street sweepers if we hadn't known these people? You can't separate out what you've lived from what you are. And sure, I've got a great character here, I think. I think it's fair to say other people think I have a great character here. I certainly have one who held my attention, and I think who took a certain control of the book because of the energy that she generated in life and in my psyche, and hence the Mighty Franks.
It sort of brings up another question that I had, which is, anybody I think who's thought of writing about their families or about anyone close to them has thought, gee, that person's going to read this. And I was wondering who in your family you were most worried about reading it. Was your mother, your aunt, your brothers, your daughter? I know you haven't allowed your daughter to read it yet. So if you can speak to that.
I really wasn't worried about anyone reading it, quite honestly.
Really?
I'd made the decision, if I was going to write this book, that it was my story. I think everyone is entitled. My aunt always used to say to me, one of her many writing lessons that came flowing along, was every writer is free to write whatever he or she wants. And I didn't need her permission, but I acknowledge it here. I think we are all autonomous people. We all have our own life, our own perspective, and if we're writers, then we're free to write it. And that's it.
So a kind of related question, but do you think that you're most changed by having written the book, having published the book, or having other people read the book and know whatever they know about you?
Well, the peculiar thing is that, as you know, I'm a rather private person, so I'm pretending that all this is just happening out in the world, and I'm here temporarily and soon returning to my hovel at my desk, where I have many, many things that I want to write and that I am writing. But I think I felt a weight on me for a very long, perhaps a too long time, and that I don't feel anymore. I felt the weight of this story, the weight of living with it and under it, and also this other rather strange thing that occurred to me at some point in my later childhood, which was I felt like somehow I had wandered into a book, a story, and was living it because of the theatrical way so many of these people behaved, and because of the way everything was narrated so forcefully and vehemently and passionately by my aunt and uncle, even in a way from all my mother's storytelling. I felt like this was already, in a way, something that existed, and I had to not simply, but with some complexity and difficulty, of course, and suffering, translate it, transmit it, be done with it. Although I'm not quite done with it, because, of course, there's still more to say, but capture it anyway.
And when did you realize, what age, that you actually had material, I mean, with a capital M, like you had a story here to tell, or was it just right before you started writing?
I think it was just in the writing of this book that I became fairly sure that there was something there.
Do you want to open?
Sure, yeah, let's go. Thank you, Sarah, for such excellent questions. Are we asking people if they have any? Is it?
Thank you. I have two questions. One is, in the writing process, when did you go from fiction to nonfiction? You say you realized this would be better, but a little more about
Many
that
years passed. I
decision.
wrote this as fiction more than 10 years ago and put it away and started completely from scratch. I didn't even look at the original, the first version, when I wrote this book. I had no interest in being in that language or that voice.
And then the other question, I'm curious, you say, we all have our own stories. We can write what we want to write. But does that mean we can read what we want to read? So your daughter can't read it yet. And why your decision is to do that? I could see that. I would probably want the same thing with my own kid. But I would love to hear more about that.
This is actually, it's a fairly complicated subject.
Yeah.
It's something I want to write about. And I think it really touches as much on parenting as it does on writing. Which is so much of when I was a child, so much of my sense of my wider family was determined by these strong opinions that were being handed down as though they were gospel, that I did not know were even subjective or interpretive takes on other human beings, that I wanted my daughter to have her own experience of these people, to achieve a certain age in which she would have lived and experienced not these same people, because she is not me, they are much older, lots of things have changed, but I wanted her to know them and experience them for herself without my mediation. And so long before I wrote the book, when she was a small child, I let her live as I lived. Obviously, I didn't have any worry. We don't live in the same city. We're not exposed in the same way. And I wasn't entrusting her as much as, for various complex reasons, my parents entrusted me to my aunt and uncle. Now she's turning 12, and it's not so much that there's anything I don't want her to know. I want her to know this story, but I want her to achieve a little bit more of her own life first, because it's a book very much of a certain middle point in life, quite honestly. It has a certain far-looking backward perspective that will escape, whose meaning and significance will escape her utterly, I would say, But it's not that I'm hiding anything from her. And anyway, she's going to win, because that's how that goes, as we know.
You speak about your writing with more self-confidence than just about anybody I've ever heard. And I wonder if you think that's a gift of your aunt.
And I sound so uncertain to myself that that's funny. I think it's just that I've thought a lot about this book and how to present, which is a kind of prickly thing to present so complicated thing, so personal a story in such a public way. And so I've developed, I think, a language for how to talk about it. And yes, there was a lot of example of being very confident in my family. My grandmother, and this somehow became transmitted to me, was transmitted to me. I'm actually writing about this also right now for a short piece. Imagine that power of deciding how to pitch and what to pitch for movies. Is this, you have a certain confidence about your reading skills. And having reviewed books for a long time, I think I'm not a bad reader of books. That also was a help. But
I have a related question, which is, it's like a matriarchy, which is very, very unusual. Your grandmother, your aunt, not so much your mother, but surrounded by these very powerful women, and then you're in a generation of all boys, at least your family, and just sort of if you can comment about either what sort of I don't know, just how that affected the whole outcome of.
Well, there were also some very powerful men in my life. My father, as a personality and a psyche, is very powerful. My uncle had his very powerful side, except with relation with regard to my aunt. And my grandfather, who was an incredibly charismatic rabbi who died before I was born, lives on as this sort of myth of how you can be in the world, be a certain sort of very connected, very intelligent, intellectual, religious practitioner. Something that is mystifying to me, I think. But so there were this was all counterbalanced. It's not as much a part of this particular thread as I said earlier. There's that thread through the book. I could have pulled the male thread through in a different way.
But your
I'm not
dad
sure
is
that's it.
your dad. I mean, who was the sister of this
Brother.
the brother. His sister was your Aunt Hank, who was the power. But he, I would say, acted the very least of any of the people in the book, as far as I can tell. But maybe that's just the following.
One
the
thing he
single
always
thread.
did was support my interpretation of what was going on,
Oh,
and that
I
was a
see.
huge gift from him. He might not have known how to handle her or the family situation better than anybody else, but he supported with great clarity the point of view that I held. And the thing to remember, and this was pointed out to me by somebody, a reader, is that it wasn't a family you could walk away. I mean, maybe we can all ultimately walk away from our families, or maybe not. But in this one, if you took a step to the right, there were 14 threads from all this interconnectivity pulling you back to the left. And it was very difficult to be distanced when things are so tightly interwoven.
I have
I could just sigh at that one.
I have a theory, and feel free to shoot it down. But
Certainly.
you said that it's your story, and you really didn't care who might read it. But if I'm not mistaken, your aunt, the central hero and villain of the story, is not really able to read at this point. And I just wonder whether you wrote it as fiction when she was still able to read. And now that she's not able to read, you were able to write it as fact.
Is that a question, Harry?
I said it's a theory which you can shoot down.
I think there's something to that. Margaret.
So there are families that have legends about themselves, and obviously yours is one, and even a name for itself, the Mighty Franks. And I wondered if writing the book or just thinking back on this, you've come to any sort of larger thoughts about where that becomes pathological and where it continues to be a sort of, to use the term gift again, to people who are part of it, who are embraced by that kind of sense of being a magical unit.
It's a great question, and I don't think I even thought about that until the book was in the world, quite honestly. I only thought that it was pathological or funny, ironic, grandiose, yet another form of self-invention. And to the point that I start calling the children the mini Mighty Franks and the dog as the mini dog Frank. I have a sense of humor about the whole thing. Would you like, a little mini Mighty Frank cupcake when you come over for tea? But, it's sort of like in keeping with the observation Sarah made earlier about what a gift this is in a sense, I had dinner with an old friend who said to me, I don't think you realize how lucky you are in a way to have been given so much. And I think it's taken me a long time to appreciate. I do appreciate the goodness, and I think in the book I'm very clear about that, but almost the thing you're asking, the mighty frankiness of it all. I mean, will I ever be able to say that with a straight face? I don't think so. But there is something about it that gives you a sense of specialness. And the specialness as it was bestowed, I think, was unhealthy. But I feel like I'm refining in my own little distillery and trying to find just the right amount of it for myself and maybe for my daughter. It was unbridled, unmediated, sick, and that's, of course, you can tell, not how I would push it forward in time.
Was there a sense of humor about it at all, or you
Zero.
Okay, so that might be the crucial ingredient, right?
Irony is what saves you always, in my opinion. And I will say my aunt was not a very ironic human being, which is something that took me years to recognize. My uncle had amazing humor, though not even about my aunt. My mother has amazing humor. My grandfather had amazing humor. My aunt was pretty dead serious. That's not a good way to live, I don't think. That's a very good question. Thank you. Spencer.
You've talked a lot about how this was kind of like a really big weight off your back after writing it. Do you see yourself writing more personal stories in the future? Or maybe another question might be, how has writing this book impacted either the way you write or what you like to write?
Excellent. Thank you for asking. So when I finished the book, I was so sick of these people. And in a way, I still am, that I wrote a lot of short stories to kind of clear my brain. And so I immediately went back to something that was familiar. However, there is my grandmother's. The one question that keeps coming up that I don't think I've satisfactorily answered in the book. See, not everything is so certain. And probably not until I could write this next thing, is the why of my aunt's very specific personality. And I believe that the answer to that why is lodged in the life of my grandmother, who kept a diary herself for most of her life, which I now have access to. I didn't for a lot of my life. And I'm very seriously, but not quite right away, considering writing what I call Before They Were Mighty, the prequel, the story that came before this story. But I think it may end up being one of these hybrids of fact that leaps into fiction. There are a couple of books that have been doing that recently that have really spoken to me. War and Turpentine is one, a book that is offered as a novel but reads very much like memoir, one feels, is The Door, Magda Szabo. There's what Rachel Cusk is doing. And so I think there are many other examples. I think there's a way to live in both worlds, but I still have to figure that out. Thank you for that question.
So was your aunt right about you, and was she right about your brothers?
She's not writing anymore, but
Was she right? Was she
was she
correct?
right? Was she correct?
Yeah.
My middle brother did become a scientist. He's a doctor, yes. My younger brother is a wonderful athlete, but he is also a writer and a teacher, so no. Two out of three, I guess, is what she came up with. Thank you.
Michael, I have two questions. One is, what really did she do that you feel was so bad about her influence? Because we are all influenced by teachers, coaches, families, and so forth. I have not read the book, so I really don't know. Like, you gave the example of the book that she gave you. What was wrong with that? I mean,
nothing.
Okay. So in a sense, what is it that bothers you about? That's number one. Number two, has she ever admitted to you, or when you spoke with her, whether she exerted an influence that she should have not?
So, Emil, the answer to number one really is, I think you have to read the book to see. It's a very complicated story, but in 3 or 4 words, she couldn't tolerate dissent an opposing point of view or another reading of reality. And her reading of reality as she got older became very skewed. And so it wasn't that she did something bad to me in a therapeutic sense, but she went into another world psychologically, and that made living in family life together quite difficult. What was the second question? I'm sorry, I got lost in that.
Has she ever admitted to you
Never.
that she... Never.
No, quite the opposite. When confronted with her behavior, and her behavior was very consistent. I wasn't the only recipient of some of her very particular expressions of friendship and family relationship. There's a whole cast of characters.
Maybe you should read one of those passages about her behavior.
I always like to just leave you all with the happy story here.
So she was almost like a Stalin, a dictator. Is that what you're essentially?
The word tyrannical is appropriate.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Our wonderful bookseller here reminds us that we don't want to hear everything about it tonight, and we're going to wind down in a couple minutes and have our wonderful wine and cheese downstairs if we like, and I'll sign books happily. But believe me, it's not all happy from here forward. Betsy, go ahead, and then I'll read maybe a paragraph more.
I just wonder, after what you lived through with your aunt, when did you decide that you wanted to marry and have a family? And what did you say to this lovely lady?
I said, you want to meet some crazy people? And we weren't even dating. And and this actually is a wonderfully bizarre story that only happens in life. My wife, who is here today, Joanne, was visiting Los Angeles while I was there for a family thing. And she was there on business, and I picked her up. She was my neighbor and friend, and we went for a hike. And after the hike, I found myself driving like on some weird drugged autopilot. You know that scene in Annie Hall when Christopher Walken is driving? Like, I was driving sort of like that, and next thing I know, I was in front of my aunt and uncle's house. Like, what was I doing? I had zero consciousness, and I'm not an unconscious, or don't think I'm an unconscious human being. Took her in to have a nice meet and greet. And then I took her to my parents for a meet and greet. And I had never taken anyone to my aunt and uncle's except in earlier life, and that hadn't gone very well. That's all I can say. Yeah. That would be a 2-hour answer, but that's the anecdotal moment of how these two worlds came together. Let me read you this little bit in conclusion. Whatever it is, I'm trusting Sarah. I can't read this. It's too long. What do you think? No, it's just that. Oh. All right. Really? Okay. This is my last event for a while. Of course, it's nice to end on a down note. My second grandmother died after my first grandmother. They'd lived together for 12 years, and the second grandmother, I have to call her that even still, survived for 4 more years, and we became very close. She was born in Sfat, in what was then Palestine, in maybe 1898. Girls were not important enough to have their birth dates written down. She immigrated to Montreal in 1914 at 16 years old with her 14-year-old sister, and where they went to work as teachers of Hebrew, which they spoke in addition to Arabic and French and Yiddish, and earned enough money to bring the rest of the family over. Such a cheery childhood. And she was a very loving human being. And on the morning she died, still living in the apartment shared previously with my paternal grandmother, where all the objects and furniture belonged, now it was assumed to my aunt, because my second grandmother was kind of like a boarder with my first grandmother. My aunt came to pick me up for a little bit of an adventure on the day my grandmother died. We headed down Lookout to Laurel Canyon, where we followed the familiar bends in the road, descending the hill and heading toward the city. Where in the city? Where was it so important for my aunt to go on the day that my grandmother had died? I began to feel an uneasiness even before my aunt turned left at Hollywood Boulevard. It deepened as we continued east on that familiar stretch of road. At Ogden, she turned right and parked across the street from the apartment. She looked for a moment at the building she had not entered in the years since Huffy had died, except that one time when she siphoned off the furniture and objects she wanted for herself. She and my uncle were going on location with their newest movie, she reminded me. They'd been planning to leave for Georgia a week earlier, but with Sylvia not quite right, they had decided to postpone their departure. Now they were to leave the next weekend. That gave her a scant 5 days to deal with things. It was a big job, she said, and she needed the most able hands. She knew. My hands. I listened to all this without quite understanding what she was intending. It was as though the conversation were happening on the other side of a glass wall, or maybe up on a screen. It was only when her car door opened and she got out and waited for me to open my door and get out that I realized she was asking me to go into the apartment with her that very morning, the morning of my grandmother's death, and help her deal with things. What things? Deal how? I had no idea, but as usual, even with a tightening stomach, I followed. I followed her where she had not gone for nearly 4 years, in between the red brick pillars and up the pink concrete stairs, past the rose bushes and the birds of paradise and the camellias to the front door of the apartment. She fumbled in her purse for an envelope, which she opened. She took out a key and inserted it into the lock. The door did not open at first, and she asked me to help. I knew the key. I knew the lock. I knew the door. The apartment was more silent than I had ever before experienced it, and it was dark and cold, as if the very breath had come out of it, too. When I saw Sylvia's silver-rimmed eyeglasses, lying upside down on her bedside table, just where she'd left them before going to sleep, assuming she'd slept, had she slept? Had she cried out, or known what was happening? I felt my heart twist in my chest, and I thought, I will never forget seeing these glasses lying on this table, in this darkened room, in this apartment, on this street, on this morning. I stood there for the longest time, looking at the glasses, the books by the bed with its slight indentation in the middle where she nestled. I looked at my grandmother's robe draped over the back of the self-rocking rocking chair. The dish full of spare change on the top of the dresser, the photographs of my grandfather, the card I had made her a month earlier for her 74th birthday, or rather for the day she decided was her 74th birthday, which was Lincoln's birthday, because he was to her mind the greatest president and the finest of men. And if she could choose when to be born, why not choose to share the day with a human being like that? As I looked at all this, my aunt stepped over to the window. She yanked the curtains open, and light flooded into the room. "Let's get started," she said. She went into the kitchen and returned with a box of large black garbage bags. She took one out and shook some air into it with a loud, snapping motion. It was as though an enormous black raven had just materialized between us. Swoosh went the raven, and my aunt turned to my grandmother's dresser, bottom drawer first. In big, untidy handfuls, she took out her sweaters, her hats, her scarves, and she fed them to the hungry black bird while I looked on, paralyzed. "Won't you at least hold the bag open for me?" When I didn't move, she said, "What's the matter, Mike? Are you not up to this? It's okay if you're not." I didn't answer. "Would you like me to take you back up the hill? I will, you know." And leave her there to throw my grandmother's world away? I shook my head. Thank you all.